Advanced Higher Historians, and welcome to the next lesson for our Russian topic, which is the impact of World War I. So our learning intention is about how the First World War actually impacted on Russia, and it's helping to still pave this way into the February Revolution, which is where we are going to next. Our context is still topic 1, which is Russia and Revolution. And our 2 success criteria points that you need to be able to do is that you can understand the impact that World War I had on the Tsarist regime, and you can start to see how these events that we've been talking about so far, plus this one as our catalyst, remember we talked about this being the catalyst, led to the February Revolution happening in 1917. We're still on chapter 3 from the textbook. Again, if you have not downloaded or you don't have a digital copy of the textbook at this point, then you need to do that, because I have no idea what you've been doing so far, but you can't possibly have been finishing any of your tasks, which is bad. So you need to make sure you've got the tasks done and that you have got the textbook. So we're on pages 59 to 65 for this. The chapter then goes on to talk about the February Revolution, but that's in a separate lesson because it's going to be our first essay, and we are going to use that as well for our first look at the inquiry skills this year as well. In terms of an overview then, so we know August 1914, Russia enters the First World War. Tensions in the country seem to almost disappear overnight. The Tsar seems genuinely popular. The people are suddenly fascinated with this idea of patriotism and the Tsar being their leader once again. So it just goes to prove that Nicholas was actually right when it came to the Russo-Japanese War, that a good war will actually keep people preoccupied from maybe what's going on in the economy. However, as the Russo-Japanese War has shown, only if that war successful or goes well. Okay, and we'll come back to that point. His actions were applauded. Workers, peasants, the aristocrats, all of them joined in this sort of idea of patriotic enthusiasm. They were fighting against a known foe. They were allied with the sort of Britain and France and making this huge kind of movement forward in terms of Russia as a superpower, and they were going to win this. This was kind of the idea that they'd been given by that. All anti-government strikes and demonstrations are abandoned, and it suddenly is a very happy, feel-good feeling in Russia. But this good feeling is rather short-lived, because it becomes very apparent very quickly that the Tsar is not the general and the military leader that they need at this point in time. As the war then continues, the Tsar begins to lose the support of key sections of Russian society, and that will ultimately lead to the First World War being the catalyst for the February Revolution. It's this lack of support or loss of support that he has maybe clung on to up to this point. So this is a really nice map, which I quite like, because I do like colourful maps, but it gives you an idea of where Russia kind of got involved in the war and what happened. So starting just at the top here, you can see that in early August 1914, we've got a Russian army advancing 160 kilometres into Austria. 2 Russian armies advanced into the German province of East Prussia. So that's this bit here, this bit here, and this bit here. And genuinely, it looks like it's going okay at this point. Between the 26th and the 29th of August 1914, a German army then surrounds and traps one of the Russian armies at the swampland in Tannenberg. 70,000 soldiers are killed and wounded, and 50,000 more are taken prisoner on top of that. The Russian commander at the time was so ashamed that he committed suicide, and that is happening, if I just circle it, over here. Now, that's going to be an important name, Tannenberg, to look at in more detail later on in this PowerPoint, so keep an idea on that. So Tannenberg is there. Bit of a disaster, and one of only the first of many for Russia at this point in time. Then between the 5th and the 9th of September, the German army advanced northwards by rail and defeated the second Russian army at the Battle of Masary Lakes. Again, 100,000 Russians are killed or wounded, and the Russian, what was called the steamroller, which is the name given to the Russian army, had pretty much been destroyed at this point. So again, just looking at the map, that's here. And again, this is going to be an important point later on for you to have a look at. Then in May 1915, a joint Austro-German offensive forced the Russians to retreat from Germany back into Russia, a distance of over 480 kilometres. The only reason that they didn't actually keep advancing is because the Russian winter prevented them from doing so. So ultimately they were forced back, but it doesn't necessarily count as a defeat because they were able to keep some ground because the winter and the weather was not good for the Austro-German forces to continue advancing. Then in June 1916, the Russian counterattack drove deep into Austrian territory. It regained quite a lot of the land that they had lost in May 1915. However, German reinforcements arrived in time and saved Austria. They stopped the Russian advance, and they started to pursue Russia as they retreated back into Russian territory, with about 1 million Russian deaths happening. So in the space of 2 years, there is an awful lot of people being killed or wounded and generally very badly injured, so it doesn't look like it's going well. And these are just the key events. There are other sort of smaller skirmishes and things like that that are happening, which are causing more wounded and more death as well. So this is a really great map. I would really strongly recommend that you take a screenshot of it, or you put a copy of it someplace, or leave a space for it in your notes, and I will make sure when we go back to school that I have a printed copy for you. Or if you have a printer, you could screenshot it and print it, or print the paper copy that I'm going to give you as well and stick it in as well so you can see those things. So the impact of World War I ultimately can be classed into 7 major areas. You've got economic problems in absolute spades, which we've been talking about, so serious economic problems in Russia, and then they're made worse by the war. You've got hunger and discontent, again, already been talking about that, but again made worse by the war. You've got social changes that are starting to happen, which is partly to do with WITS initiatives and things like that, but also because people are becoming more and more politically aware, and they're starting to see this as a more of an issue and things like that as well. So we'll talk about that. There's criticisms of the Tsarina, who is left in charge of the country when Nicholas decides to take himself off to the front lines. Military defeats, as we've kind of already seen, are quite severe and are an issue. The Tsar then falls under heavy criticism because as he's put himself out there on the front lines, he is the one that is leading the charge and controlling everything. So it makes it look like all of their defeats are not just Russia's defeats, but Nicholas's defeats as well. And then there's the impact of Rasputin, who we will come back to. Try not to say his name too loud in case he appears. So the textbook sections for these, which have a lot of really good notes, and there's some fantastic sources talking about it, diary entries and other historians' points of view, are on page 59 to 64 of the textbook. Kind of make sure that you're checking the page number on the actual page, not on the sort of online counter, because it will count like the front cover page as 1 and things like that. So check the actual pages themselves. So 59 to 64 gives you a load of information about that, and you are going to use those pages with the next couple of slides and the task to fill in the worksheet that has been attached this week. Before we go on to that, I have a nice mind map that kind of covers these areas, which you should then make a copy of into your notes. Again, make sure you use different colours and things, do doodles, make it look a wee bit interesting, and as you read through the textbook section as well, feel free to add any other extra details or specifically examples. If you can put examples in or views of historians and things like that, put that in it as well. So the economic problems that Russia has, there's kind of 3 areas here. The first is that over 15 million men have left to join the army, and this leaves fields and factories in both the rural and the urban sort of working environments without enough workers, which then leads to a severe shortage of materials for the war, and then a diversion of all working people to make the materials for the war, which leads to a shortage of materials for the people back home. It also leads to a shortage of food because there's no one to really farm and to work on these arable land areas, and remember, they've been given the land sort of back to use with the chance to buy their own land and things like that. So if they go away to join the army, there's no one really to work on these lands, and the mere communes have been stopped. So there's a very severe shortage of food happening in Russia, to the extent that sort of rationing in Russia would have happened much sooner than it would have in other places, because they were already quite short and rationing had already been happening. So this kind of added to that excess strain. War is an economic black hole anyway, and in a country that was already kind of circling the drain, as it were, it's not going to be a good thing to do. Also, the railway system that is in Russia, the Trans-Siberian Railway, which we looked at, there's also an absolutely brilliant documentary in the YouTube playlist for our channel for Advanced Hire, which is about the Trans-Siberian Railway. So if you're looking for more information and more points and stuff like that, I would really strongly recommend that you check that out, because it is actually a very good documentary. But the railway system anyway fails to cope with the additional demands of the war, which causes inadequate supplies to be able to reach the front in time for any sort of battles or just to even resupply them. It leads to food shortages in towns because the food cannot be properly distributed, and it leads to coal shortages in the cities, which leads to power failures and to factories having to close down as a result of not having the coal to burn. Food prices start to skyrocket, so that families that are living both in rural and urban areas can actually not afford to eat as much, and again they're struggling to just make ends meet at all. So economically, the impact of the First World War was an absolute disaster. This obviously leads to hunger and discontent, and I will reiterate that hungry and discontented people are revolutionary people. They are grumpy and they are revolutionary. So these food shortages and the price rising caused a lot of discontent from the workers in the towns especially, who had moved into these sort of from these rural areas into these urban working environments with the idea that their lives would be better and that they would not have to face the same sort of level of starvation and things like that. So obviously this is quite a serious problem for them. In terms of social changes, the war obviously makes a lot of jobs, so that part is sort of slightly good for the economy, but it creates a lot of jobs in places like armament factories, working on the railways, transporting goods and things like that, which means a lot of people will start to move again from these rural areas into the urban areas looking for jobs. And the number of town workers will steadily increase, and it starts to rapidly increase as the peasants start to realise that this is a potential job opportunity for them. Now, that's good in terms of obviously keeping the economy going, but the problem that is it means that there's no one left to actually farm the land, because the peasants have left the countryside to go into the cities, and also the cities become very overcrowded, and sometimes factories are obviously closing down because the materials are not getting into the cities to be used, or the coal's not there for it to actually be working. So this leads to high levels of unemployment in the cities, which leads to a lot of people out in the streets, higher crime rates and stuff like that. But it also leads to a fundamental change in the way people consider themselves. So if you were a peasant living in the countryside, your real focus is on the countryside and the sort of countryside investos and things like that that keep you going. They're your kind of local councils, that is what you listen to. When you make a change and move into an urban area, you're becoming an urban worker, and this gives you almost more of a sense of what's actually happening within the capitals and within the cities themselves, where the parties that are growing and the Dumas and things like that are the things that you pay attention to. And you suddenly very quickly start to find that these people will have more of an opinion about what should be happening and what isn't happening in Russia. So they want to actually do something about that. And this leads to the social change. These people are no longer peasants out in the countryside oblivious to everything. They are now urbanites, urban workers, and those are the people that Marx had said would be the ones that would lead in revolution. So that's kind of what we're starting to see happening here. We're starting to see these people coming in and making these changes. In terms of criticisms of the Tsarina, generally she's very inexperienced, she is incompetent, and it's not a very nice thing to say, but she wasn't a particularly good ruler, and under her very unwatchful eye, the government pretty much ceased to function properly. Not that it functioned particularly well to begin with, but she was very much a ruler that tried to just keep things the way they were and didn't want to make any real changing decisions, which when you're at a state of war is not useful for you or for your country. She relied quite heavily on the advice of the unpopular Mad Monk, aka Rasputin. She was massively unpopular personally because she was German. She'd been born in Germany, and though she had converted to the Orthodox Russian Church when she married Nicholas, the people in the court and the people in the government were absolutely convinced that she was an alien. She was other. She was one of them and not one of us. They even referred to her as that German woman. So you can kind of see the level of contempt that was already there for her. And when you're at war with a country, it's very, very difficult to then accept the daughter of a noble or of another sort of group from that country as your leader. Very, very difficult for the people to do that. There were also some sort of rumours circulating around that she and Rasputin were working to ensure a German victory by trying to keep Russia down. And there may have been some sort of conspiracy about this, but there's no record of whether this was true or not. But the rumours were enough that they just distrusted her. And the more and more that she didn't listen to the other governors and listen to what Rasputin wanted to do, or appointed and dismissed people based on Rasputin's view, the more that she was disliked. And the more that the criticisms on her reflected on the criticisms of the Tsar. In terms of these criticisms of the Tsar, he is blamed for three main things. One, the military defeats, because personally he is taking command of the army in August 1915. What on earth he thought he was doing, I don't know, because he is not a military man. He has absolutely no real understanding of military. He has never been in any sort of real proper military battles. Thinking that he could personally go to the front and lead them to victory was a bit ridiculous and a bit stupid. The weak government of the Tsarina that he obviously leaves in charge reflects badly on him as well. And his refusal to choose new ministers from the Duma, because he just didn't want to deal with that, means that pretty much all the things and the gains that he had made after 1905 more or less just collapse, and again more criticism follows. Then you add in the military defeats. The Russian army's very, very large, biggest army. It's called the steamroller for a reason, because it's huge, but it's badly led and it's badly equipped. So even a broken and driverless steamroller is not going to be effective. In 1914 they lost these two major battles with a lot of them wounded or captured, and then it caused a lot of civilian anger and a loss of morale, and this patriotic feeling that Nicholas was riding the high of suddenly went away very, very quickly. Oh no, we said Rasputin's name too many times. Yes, we did, but we're not ready for you yet. You've still got a little bit of time. Right, we'll go away just now. Sorry about him. Anyway, so now we're thinking about how did this ultimately lead to the Tsar being weakened? How has the Tsar's government been properly weakened again here at this point from the war going forward? What you're going to do for this is using the information on the next few slides and this worksheet, which you'll find attached on the team. You're going to fill in some details and then go back and use that section of the textbook to add any examples and things like that as we go. So the army were made up of conscripts, which obviously means that not everybody had actually volunteered to be there, which again is a weakening right away, because generally the people that are there are only going to be there and be happy to be there as long as they are winning and this idea of patriotism keeps going. When they start to lose, the people that have been conscripted in or forced in will start to become quite angry. The leadership of the army is really poor, which we'll go into in a little bit more detail in a second. The treatment of the soldiers and the sort of people fighting by the officers is not particularly great. They are very much still the sort of bottom of the pecking order, which was not what they were looking for after the 1905 revolution and the October Manifesto. And there's general shortages of things like rifles, ammunition and boots, which if you're fighting a war is probably 3 of the things that you would probably want to have on your side, but I'll come back to that in a second or two. The point that we need to know is that by kind of 1917, and especially February first of all, but then by October, a lot of the people in the army are starting to side with the more radical socialist revolutionary groups, and in particular the Bolsheviks, who are starting to say things like, we should not be fighting this war, or even if we are fighting this war, these are the things that should happen to ensure that leadership is better, that the treatment is better, and that everyone has enough materials. So in terms of the poor leadership, the officers are generally incompetent, inexperienced or lazy, because remember, they have been appointed in these positions because they are high born, they are noble born, and or are the Tsar's friends, and he has put them in, or family members, and he's put them in these positions. So they don't really know what they're doing, they don't have a lot of experience, and the ones that maybe do are maybe not being listened to, which is obviously an issue. In 1914, they moved their armies into Russia too quickly, which meant that by the time they were actually bedding down, they were way ahead of their support and all of their supplies, and it just became more increasingly difficult to actually get these supplies to them. We've already said that the Tsar was a weak leader. Remember, there's the quote from the minister who said he's not fit to run a village post office, never mind an entire country. So he's blamed for these military defeats. And Russia's image takes a really strong hit on this. So he goes from being a strong, competent leader from the very, very beginning when he's crowned, to slowly eroding further and further away, to the point that you could argue that his performance in the war is the kind of final thing that shatters this image, and he no longer is that competent, perfect leader, this kind of mini god that the people had grown up thinking that the Tsars ultimately were. Nicholas had broken the mould on that, and they didn't really know what to do with that, just that he was no longer the leader that they felt they deserved, or that they actually wanted. Obviously, while the Tsar was away, the Tsarina and Rasputin were left in charge, which, as we've talked about, was poor leadership back on the home front as well. And these two things together made things not so good in Russia. Had the leadership on the home front been good and things, they could maybe have excused slightly poorer leadership on the kind of front lines, and vice versa. If the front lines had been fine, they could have really excused the issues at home, but both of them being an issue and being a disaster meant that the people were like, right, no, this is it, enough, we need to move on and find something else. Again, like we said, the Tsarina was despised for her German family, and Rasputin was despised for, well, use your imagination, pretty much everything. But again, we'll come back to Yes, we can see you again. I just said we'll come back to you. Not just now. Well, move then. Sorry about him again. Anyway, so in terms of the infrastructure and the transport in Russia, which again had a big impact, the roads are inadequate, the railway system is inadequate, and supplies just cannot reach the front line, which means that the army is going to suffer. Communication is really very difficult as well, and what's happening is that they can't pass memos, it's too far away, and the radio signals that they're using are being taken and intercepted by the Germans, which means that one, they can be decoded, and then they can be found out what they're actually doing, and then two, they can find the Russians' positions really easily, and they can countermand any sort of attack that they're trying to organise. In terms of supply and equipment, we have some soldiers that have bullets but have no guns. Other parts of the front line, we have some soldiers that have guns but no bullets. Some of them don't have winter coats, which means that they are freezing to death where they are and trying to wrap themselves up in rags and things. Some of them don't actually have boots, or they have one boot and not another one, so things are not going particularly well. And it's generally very old-fashioned. Russia is a very backwards country in terms of their modernisation, remember, at this point in time. So they're still fighting with cavalry horses and lances the way they would have done years previous. But the First World War was a war of technological change, and it was the war where new technologies were used and developed, and older technologies were used to a very full deadly extent. And while both sides did have cavalry, the Russian cavalry was literally one of their best defence and attack mechanisms, whereas on the other side you have the Germans with machine guns, which are very effective apparently against cavalry horses, and tanks, which again are very effective against cavalry and horses. So generally speaking, they are out-equipped, outmatched, and just generally outclassed by the German people that they are fighting. Again, if they had particularly clever leadership and good communications and good equipment, the war could have been a very different situation for Russia. But as it stands, they are pretty much being beaten into the ground the same way as they were with the war with Japan. The only difference here is they have the Allies on the other side, so they're not actually bearing the full brunt of Germany's forces, they're only taking some of it, while Britain and France and the others on the Eastern Front are actually busy doing that. The Western Front, sorry, busy doing that. On the Eastern Front, they're only dealing with one side of it. Just as a quick research task to add to your notes, put it into Google, the two battles that you can see here, Russians' involvement. We talked about them right at the very beginning on that map, but see if you can find some more information. In particular, look to see if you can find any historians' views or views from people at the time, how they felt the battles had gone or what their opinions were, and make a note of these. If you can't, don't worry about it. Just get some information that you can add to your notes about how the army was faring and things as well. So this table here is actually really nice. It shows the comparative losses in First World War for all of the different people fighting. And as you can see with this, Russia is obviously the one that is suffering the most men killed in battle, even compared to Germany and Britain and France. They are the ones that lose the most people. So this has an obvious knock-on effect in terms of how unhappy the people in Russia actually are going to be. So it's just a really nice graph. You can feel free to make a copy of it if you like, but it's just a really nice way to cement the things that we've been talking about so far. So the peasants, the workers and the ethnic minorities then. Huge casualties amongst these particular groups, roughly about 9.15 million people. Where Russia's getting all these people from, I don't know. This is going to become a recurring theme throughout this whole year where I'm going to say that. I don't know where all these people are coming from, but they have huge numbers of casualties within this particular group. So huge casualties for the peasants, the workers and the ethnic minorities. The government did not pay for food, which meant that a lot of them went hungry, so they faced real starvation and bread queues and things like that. The government abandoned plans to take food by force because they were trying to do that because it would result in civil war and catastrophe. There was a revolt in Central Russia, Asian Russia in 1916, which resulted in some of the ethnic minorities breaking away. An extra 3.5 million industrial jobs were created, which sounds great, but the wages were very poor. So those who were moving into the cities to get these jobs, like we said, were not finding their situation was made any better, and this was making them generally quite angry. The shortages in the cities for food became very, very dire, with people queuing sometimes for up to 24 hours just to get a loaf of bread. The distribution of food was, was a bit poor as well. They're not able to get food easily, they've got to go and queue in places, and again sometimes they're there overnight waiting in the queues, so it's not good. And basically by the time 1917 rolls around, there's about 700 peasant risings. People just genuinely just so sick of the situation that they're desperate for something else to happen. So all of these things, as you can imagine, makes the peasants and the workers and the ethnic minorities very angry. The ethnic minorities want away from Russia's control. The peasants want more land, more food, more freedoms. The workers want more food. They want more say in their government. They're just wanting more. And Russia's not prepared to give them more as it currently stands. In terms of the workforce, they were desperate to get as much material out as they could for the front lines, but again, conditions and wages are not great, so you've got a lot of strikes happening as well in 1916 to try and get people to pay attention to them, which again leads to this more political revolutionary feel for the country. The middle class, on the other hand, which is a different group, how are they faring? Generally they are appalled by the inefficiency of the government in running war. They're not happy about this. They set up their own medical organisations to try and deal with sort of supplies and demand for medications and things. Remember in 1918 you've got Spanish flu sweeping across Europe, which has a really serious impact as well. A lot of them joined war committees to try and have a say in how they felt the war should be run and what should be done instead of what was happening. The middle class organisations are usually more efficient than the government actually is at distributing medicine, organising the war at home and organising things as well. The industrialists were short of raw materials, so they were unhappy because they couldn't meet the demands. And a progressive bloc was formed in the government, or to the government at this point in time. The Duma was dismissed, which made people angry as well. In terms of the aristocracy, the people at the top, the Council of the United Nobility, basically all of the higher up people, called for the Tsar to step down in 1916. They were convinced that his time had come and that was enough. It was time for him to step aside. One of the reasons for this is there's a lot of junior officers lost, so people who are junior officers in the army that would have been part of this aristocracy group, and this means that families are maybe losing their heirs, which makes them very unhappy and angry. The conscription threatens their estates because they're losing, that went very skew, they're losing manpower, they're losing people in general as well, which is not a good sort of situation. And then on top of this you've got Rasputin and the Tsarina, who pretty much are just making a mockery of what they see to be the aristocracy's way forward and how to kind of deal with this. Okay, so pause the video roughly at about 33 minutes and 40 seconds. Make sure you've got all the information from the last few slides and the textbook to fill in your worksheet, both sides, and then come back to the video at roughly 33 and 50 seconds. And we'll move on to the next task, which is going to be about Rasputin. Yes, Rasputin. Now, we'll talk about you. Fine. So, we've talked a lot about this mad monk, and he's appeared and annoyed me while I'm recording quite an awful lot of times here. You can see him located here. Here he is, in this picture that was taken from his time in court. He was a man that liked his dinner parties. Based on this, what kind of person do you actually think he is? He seems creepy, scary. Those are the kind of words that have heard him described as. He's surrounded by mostly women. There's a couple of men there, but mostly women surrounding him. He had a reputation as a kind of a bit of a ladies' man. It's actually put out as an insatiable sexual appetite, is what they say about him. But he was really very important to the Serena and seemed to have a really interesting hold over the Serena and the family, which obviously did help lead to their undoing. Now, interestingly, in a recent documentary, he was described as one of the most evil men in history. So you have to kind of question what could possibly he have done to deserve this reputation. He also has a reputation as the man who would never die, but I can explain that in a bit more detail later on. So what you're going to do for this next part is watch this documentary. It's about 25 minutes long, so it's quite a long thing to do with this PowerPoint as well. So feel free to come back to it. The link is there, but it's also in the playlist as well, so you'll be able to just go into the Advanced Hire playlist and find it and click it. Watch the video, and what I want you to do is add any notes that you can that they're talking about the war or about what's happening, and in particular think about what the people are saying. Can you add quotes? So historians are talking about things, write down any things that you think are really good quotes, write down any sort of primary sources that you find or what people from the time are saying, and add that level of detail as you kind of go. And then you can come back to the PowerPoint if you want to, or finish the PowerPoint and then do that. So the question really becomes for us then, how important was the war really in the overall collapse of the Tsarist regime? He survived up to now, so why is it the war that ultimately leads to February 1917? How important actually is it? Historians have debated this point furiously since the revolution itself actually took place in 1917, but it really boils down to two main views. The first one is that the Tsarist regime was basically stable up until 1914. Even if it had all of these important problems and things that we've looked at that they had to deal with, they were making steady progress towards becoming a modern state, but this progress was destroyed by the coming war. And it's really easy to forget that when we're looking at just one country, that the war had been very severe and damaged Germany and Austria-Hungary and Turkey as well, to the point that they were brought to their knees economically. So it wasn't just Russia that changed, it's just that Russia was the only one that changed in this particular way. The second view is that the regime in Russia was cursed with a weak Tsar. It was cursed with a backwards economy, and it was cursed with a class of aristocratic people in charge who were not prepared to share their power or their privileges with ordinary Russian people. So revolution was really only a matter of time. It was an inevitability. The war didn't cause it, it just sped it up. So these two kind of perspectives help lead into the February Revolution in general. Was it inevitable that the February Revolution would happen, or was it a spontaneous thing that just seemed to happen, which is what the red box kind of talks about there. You can make up your own mind. So your task then for this week in particular is to think about these two perspectives. And what I want you to do is get some practice at finding some historiography. So I want you to go and find, research it, just put into Google Impact of World War I on Russia, have a look at Google Scholar, have a look at Wikipedia, look at wherever you fancy, and get two perspectives on how the war impacted on the Tsarist regime and how it ultimately collapsed. So what you need to do is you need to find two historians' opinions, give both the historians' names, so say who they are and what they think about the subject. So you can paraphrase it, you can quote it, you can do a bit of both, whatever you feel comfortable with, just go with it. And then after each quote, I want you to analyse, the same as you would in an essay, what you think that they're actually trying to say with that. Once you've analysed both, you can add an analysis plus point. How could that be wrong from your own opinion? And then at the end, you just put a little blurb about which one you agree with and why you think that way. They both might agree with one another, they both might disagree with one another. You might go and find ones that agree with your point of view anyway, that's fine, but you're kind of just going to do a wee summary, like an evaluation point of which of the two opinions you think about. So structure it kind of like a paragraph for an essay. You can give a fact or sentence if you like, about there are various historical perspectives on the impact of World War I on the Tsarist regime, and then your first historian's point would be your first knowledge point. Then you could do your analysis and your analysis plus of it, and then you do your second knowledge point from your second historian, your analysis and your analysis plus on it, and then you give an evaluation of which one you think is correct or the most important and why you think that. So, quick summary then. We know that the First World War had a devastating impact on Russia, with millions killed and wounded. It was an incompetent administration, and the collapse of the distribution system resulted in a lack of supplies, weapons and medical services to the front line, and shortages of food and fuel in major cities like Petrograd. Because of this, confidence in the government plummeted. The professional classes, the businessmen, set up non-governmental organisations to try and improve supplies or war materials, and this seemed to offer an alternative form of government to the people, who started to realise that they actually weren't as reliant on the Tsar as they thought they were. The Tsar made several, not severe, or we could even say severe, stupidly bad mistakes, and he goes to the front line, taking personal responsibility by doing so for the war. He would not work with the progressive bloc in the Duma, he would not cooperate with the non-governmental organisations, and he left the Tsarina and Rasputin in charge of the government, which ultimately led to his downfall. The Tsarina and Rasputin created instability by changing ministers continually, and they became the focus of criticism and antagonism towards the regime and towards the Tsar, and the ruling elite basically lost confidence in the Tsar because he was the one that had put them in charge. By the beginning of February 1917, there is very little support left for the Tsar and his government. And this leads to the eruption of discontent in February 1917, which sees him being swept from power when finally, unlike in 1905, the army and the generals deserted him. So that's everything for this lesson. Any questions that you have, please let me know, and make sure that you follow through the PowerPoint, do the tasks, and upload your historiography by the end of the week. Thanks, folks.